My name is Kent Wong. I'm the director of the UCLA Labor Center, and I served as the founding president of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. I had the opportunity of connecting with many APALA leaders, members, and friends just 10 days ago in Washington, D.C., where we had the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance in the AFL-CIO national headquarters, where the APALA national office is located. And as part of our 30th anniversary, we published a book called Asian American Workers Rising. And many of the speakers today and in the upcoming workshops are featured in our book or were authors in our book. And you'll be hearing from extraordinary leaders of APALA over the years. We are also launching a 5-part series on racial justice that will capture the integral link between racial justice and organizing, building political power, immigrant justice, and women's rights. And so we will be having 4 more workshops this summer. We will be concluding with a 2-day border tour, which we hope many of you will be able to join us on August 27th and 28th in San Diego and in Tijuana. So we will be providing information about that very soon. But with that, I wanted to start with a PowerPoint that I prepared, and this PowerPoint is available for any of you who would like to share it with your chapters, with your unions, or with your communities. So please email me and let me know if you would like copies, and I would be happy to share it with you. So this is the PowerPoint on Asian Pacific Islander labor history. And I'll be starting with the PowerPoint, and then we will move forward and have the panel with Ligaya, Kim, and Monica immediately afterwards. So I wanted to frame the issue of anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian hate in a historic context, which is why I have put together today's PowerPoint. The Asian American and Pacific Islander labor history is largely a working class history. Chinese were the first wave of immigrants from Asia, beginning with the California gold rush back in 1849. So Asian Americans have been part of the US society for more than 170 years. The first wave of immigrants came from China, and Chinese planted the first crops in the Central Valley of California. Chinese workers also developed the fishing and cannery industries on the California coast, and Chinese workers in the emerging cities of California worked in laundry, garment, restaurant, and other low-wage, labor-intensive jobs. Many of these jobs were considered undesirable women's work. And so Chinese entered these occupations because they were barred from other employment opportunities. And so we see how the presence of Chinese workers in laundry, garment, restaurants have continued over the generations as a mainstay of employment for the Chinese American communities, especially in Chinatowns. Chinese workers built the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, linking California to the eastern United States. This was considered one of the most impressive engineering feats of the 19th century. And it was only during the Obama administration where there was national recognition of the contributions of the Chinese railroad workers. One of the earliest recorded labor actions was a strike led by Chinese railroad workers in 1867 during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad company responded by cutting off food supplies to the work camp during the winter. This is a cartoon which captures the anti-Chinese movement that unfortunately, the California Working Men's Party and other labor unions were an active part. Samuel Gompers, the founding president of the American Federation of Labor, was not only a lifelong opponent of Chinese and Asian immigration to the United States, he also barred Chinese and other Asian workers from joining US unions. And so on the left of this cartoon, you see this ugly racist caricature of a Chinese worker with a pigtail simultaneously sewing clothes, rolling cigars, working in the construction trades, working in the shoe industry. And on the left side, you see him hoarding a big bag of money. And on the right side, you see a group of unemployed white workers. And the caption of this cartoon is, "What shall we do with our boys?" And so we see that even over 150 years ago, these racist views of Chinese and other Asian and immigrant workers taking jobs from white workers was prevalent. The anti-Chinese movement resulted in the very first law in the history of the United States that barred a group based on their nationality. And this was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was a victory for the anti-Chinese movement that swept the nation. And it barred large-scale migration from China for generations, for more than 80 years. The Chinese Exclusion Act, or aspects of it, were in place. It denied citizenship rights to Chinese immigrants, and it was extended to include Japanese, Filipinos, and other Asians in later years. After the barring of Chinese migration, the second wave from Asia came from Japan. And the first wave of Japanese American workers were known as the Issei, or first generation, followed by the Nisei, second generation, Sansei, third generation, and Yonsei, fourth generation. Japanese workers came in large numbers in the 1880s following the Chinese Exclusion Act, and they worked extensively in the agricultural sector. Anti-Asian immigration policies extended to Japanese through the Immigration Act of 1924. And these are early Japanese American farm workers working the fields of California. Japanese Americans were rounded up and placed in concentration camps following Executive Order 9066, signed into law by President Franklin Roosevelt. This was one of the most egregious violations of constitutional rights. The vast majority of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II were US citizens who had never been to Japan. The third wave of immigrants from Asia were from the Philippines. And the first generation came in the 1920s and 30s, known as the Manong, or brother in the Ilocano dialect of the Philippines. Anti-Asian immigration policies did not apply because the Philippines was a protectorate or a colony of the United States. Filipinos worked primarily in agriculture and as low-wage workers in the emerging cities. And the 1934 Tidings-McDuffie Act, which granted independence to the Philippines, meant that the anti-immigration policies were imposed on Filipino immigrants as well. In 1959, the AFL-CIO established the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, primarily comprised of Filipino farm workers. Organizers included Philip Veracruz, Larry Itliong, and Dolores Huerta. In 1965, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee launched the Delano Grape Strike, which lasted for 5 years and led to the launch of the United Farm Workers of America. Many people to this day do not realize that it was the Filipino farm workers that launched the Delano Grape Strike, and that the United Farm Workers Union was a merger between a Filipino and a Mexican-American farm labor organization. This is a photo of the Filipino Hall in Delano, which was headquarters of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee back in 1965. And here is a mural that you can still see today in historic Filipino town in Los Angeles, with Larry Itliong on the right and Philip Veracruz on the left. The Immigration Act of 1965 lifted anti-Asian immigration policies that had been in existence since 1882. It led to the largest migration of Asians in US history and was a direct result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so I share, especially with Asian American audiences, that we owe collectively a debt of gratitude to the movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., by Rosa Parks, by Reverend James Lawson, and by countless other African American leaders who pushed for civil rights legislation that directly benefited the Asian American community by striking down racist immigration laws that had been in existence for more than 80 years. So the very existence of Asian America today is based on the courage and heroism of the Black-led civil rights struggle. Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic community in the US today, numbering 22 million in 2020. I wanted to touch on some of the other waves of Asian immigrants who have come to this land. US is the home to the largest Korean diaspora community in the world. There are more than 1.8 million Korean Americans. Following the Immigration Act of 1965, there was a huge spike in Korean immigration. Korean American workers are concentrated in healthcare, education, government, and service sector jobs. The very first national campaign led by the Korean American community was the successful campaign to free Chol-Soo Lee, who was unjustly convicted of murder and was on death row. And this national mobilization of Korean Americans successfully freed Chol-Soo Lee. The end of the Vietnam War in 1975 resulted in a massive refugee crisis. More than 3 million people fled Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia between 1975 and 1995. Thousands died at sea. More than 1 million South Asian refugees were resettled in the US. Many of the resettlement programs involved finding Southeast Asian workers jobs in industries needing workers, including meatpacking, electronics, government, education, healthcare, home care, farm labor, and fishing. The largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam is in Orange County, California. Low-wage jobs and high rates of poverty are prevalent among Laotian and Cambodian workers. There has been significant organizing that's taken place among the Vietnamese nail salon workers. The UCLA Labor Center recently published a study talking about the devastating impact of COVID-19 on Vietnamese nail salon workers. Immigrants from India began coming to the US in the 19th century and worked mainly in farm labor. Following the 1965 Immigration Act, temporary visas for high-skilled workers, employment-based immigration for educated workers, and large numbers of college students resulted in a massive growth of migration from South Asia. Indian American workers are concentrated in healthcare, tech industries, government, education, and the service sector. From 1980 to 2019, the Indian immigrant population increased 13-fold. As of 2019, there were about 2.7 million Indian immigrants in the US, making them the second largest immigrant group in the country after Mexicans. Barry V. Desai served on the AFL-CIO Executive Council, the first Southeast Asian woman ever to serve in that capacity. And there has been extraordinary organizing that has taken place among taxi workers, led by the Taxi Workers Alliance in New York City and in other parts of the country. There are about 1.4 million Pacific Islander Americans. The largest group are Native Hawaiians, Samoans, Chamorros, Fijians, Palauans, Tongans, and Tahitians. American Samoa, Guam, and Northern Mariana Islanders are US territories, unlike Hawaii, which gained statehood in 1959. Following the Immigration Act of 1965, thousands of Pacific Islanders migrated to the US, mainly from Samoa, Guam, Tonga, and Fiji. Pacific Islander workers are concentrated in tourism, agriculture, government, and service sector jobs. And here is a march in Honolulu to protect Hawaiian lands. And there has been a very robust and vibrant Hawaiian sovereignty movement led by Native peoples of Hawaii. This brings us to the founding 30 years ago of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance in 1992, the first national organization of Asian American workers and union members. In the 30 years since our founding, APALA has helped to recruit a new generation of Asian American and Pacific Islander union organizers and to organize more AAPI workers into unions than ever before. Over the last 30 years, literally hundreds of thousands of Asian American and Pacific Islanders have been recruited into the labor movement. APALA has been engaged in the fight for immigrant rights to provide a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants, to promote labor and community alliances for economic and racial justice, to strengthen global solidarity, especially in the Pacific Rim, and to oppose anti-Asian violence and to build multiracial unity. So in summary, the history of the Asian American and Pacific Islander story is largely a working class history. AAPI workers have been an integral part of the US workforce for more than 170 years. AAPI workers are diverse and complex and found in almost every state, every city, and every workplace in the country. Problems of discrimination, economic disparities, low wages, and a lack of advancement opportunities are still common among AAPI workers, and the labor movement has been essential in advancing the rights of AAPI workers and all workers. This is a copy of the book, which I hope that many of you have gotten and read, Asian American Workers Rising, APALA's Struggle to Transform the Labor Movement. This was taken at the 1995 APALA Convention in New York, featuring John DeLauro on the cover, who went on to become one of the APALA national presidents, and two other, Sujin Lee and Jessica Sung, who were also APALA OI graduates. Sujin is still working with the national office of APALA, and Jessica Sung was recently appointed by President Biden and serves as the first Asian woman in history on the Ninth Circuit Court. So currently, APALA is involved in a campaign to stop anti-Asian hate. This includes building multiracial unity to oppose racism and hate, supporting union organizing, defending women's rights, building AAPI political power, and stopping voter suppression, and advancing immigrant justice. And this summer, we are launching 5 online workshops. This is the first on racial justice, followed by organizing on July 20th, reproductive rights on July 27th, political power on August 10th, and immigrant rights on August 24th. We will be scheduling an in-person 2-day gathering in San Diego, Tijuana on August 27th and 28th, and we'll be taking a border tour of Tijuana to learn from the extraordinary work of labor and community activists organizing in Tijuana. And this fall, we will be launching a major voter mobilization effort across the country in preparation for the November elections in 2022. So that is the PowerPoint for this evening. And I am now very pleased to welcome our 3 guest speakers, Monica Tamaranth, Ligaya Domingo, and Kim Jerome. So if you could please turn on your videos, and I will start the questions with Ligaya Domingo. As I indicated, Ligaya Domingo works at SEIU 1199 in Seattle, Washington. She is one of the finest labor educators in the country and has served in leadership capacities and is currently one of the officers of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. Is Ligaya, oh, I see her image. And can we ask her to unmute and to turn on her video? And the question is that, I did have the pleasure of seeing Ligaya back in DC a little over a week ago to attend the APALA Executive Board and the 30th anniversary celebration of APALA. And as a current officer of APALA, could you talk about the rise of anti-Asian hate and what can APALA do to address the rise of anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence? So I know that Ligaya is with us. Can you turn on your video?
It looks like I can unmute myself, but I can't turn on my video.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but basically what's going on is before we could edit the or correct the webinar, because the webinar already started, we weren't able to edit and have people turn on their videos. So the only way to have speakers turn on videos is if we transfer host access to each speaker.
Great. Is that possible?
Yeah, so I think you're the host right now, Kent. So if you want to, it'll be like popcorn, but video, you know what I mean?
And if I make her co-host, is that good enough or does she have to be host?
She needs to be host, yeah, because I'm co-host right now and I can't turn on my video.
Oh, wait, I can turn it on as co-host, it looks like.
Oh, okay.
All right.
That's awesome.
Thank you, Ligaya. So my apologies for these technical difficulties. We were switching to a webinar format versus a Zoom format, but obviously we have a learning curve in terms of how to use the webinar format, and also we've had some technical difficulties at the UCLA Labor Center. So my apologies. But Ligaya, could you talk about what APALA can do to address anti-Asian hate and violence?
Great. Thanks, Kent. So Kent just went through a very thorough history of our experience as Asian Pacific Islanders. And part of my takeaway from that is that the experience that we've had as APIs in this country is really not new. So as APIs, we've been dubbed as a perpetual foreigner or an other. And part of what that has served is really to keep us down as API people, to see ourselves as less than, and for others to see us as less than. And in the past couple of years, we've seen a real increase in anti-Asian hate and violence that has really corresponded in many ways with the pandemic of COVID-19. And what we do know is that there are many incidents of violence that have happened before that. One of the incidents that many people know about is about Vincent Chin, which is very much integrated into, as Kent said, working class history. And so it's really important that we contextualize these examples in that history. And so what I think is really important for us within the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance is really to see ourselves and the unique role that we can play, bringing API workers together to stand up against the experiences that we're having. So one of the most critical things that we can do is to educate ourselves and talk to each other. So these webinars that Kent is hosting through the UCLA Labor Center and through APALA is really an important starting point where we can see that the experiences that we have are not unique, but that actually they're shared experiences. And the more that we can see that our experiences are shared, the more that we're going to find collectivity and connection with each other to stand up and use our voices. Some of the additional things that we are doing through APALA is that we're starting to learn skills for how we stand up and how we utilize our allies to stand up with us and for us, which is an important part of standing up against anti-Asian hate. When we feel like we're targeted, it's really hard to always be the one standing up for ourselves, but we have to find others that can stand up with us. That's part of the foundation of organizing. One of the other important things over the past couple of years that we've been doing within APALA is really understanding what's happening in our workplaces that might be going on connected to anti-Asian hate. I work with healthcare workers, some of whom are on here today, and I know that over the last 2.5 years, there have been real targeting happening within the healthcare settings of fear of healthcare workers providing care in the hospital setting because of COVID-19. People have had to stand up for their own safety in the workplace, which is really critical. And it's only by finding connection with each other and really using our voices together that we've been able to make real change in the workplace when we've needed to. We know that through APALA, we can find connection with each other and we don't have to be alone. And we can use that connectivity to build real power through our workplaces, through politics, and even through our communities. We know that API people have been organizing in the Chinatowns in Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle to make sure that people can walk down the street safely. We know that over the last few years, people have been targeted just walking down the street. I myself have had that experience as well. We have to be able to walk down the street every day in a safe way, and we can stand with each other to make sure that we can do that. So those are some of the things through APALA that we're doing, is really finding that connection with each other, organizing, educating each other, talking about how these incidents are incidents of racism. They're not just isolated incidents. It's part of how racism is working within this country against Asian people. Oftentimes, racism is talked about as a Black or white issue, and we know that it's much more complex than that, and that as API people, we experience it too. And the anti-Asian hate that we've experienced over the last few years is a clear example of that.
Thanks so much, Ligaya. And for those of you who want to read more about Ligaya's amazing history and story, please check out Asian American Workers Rising. And Ligaya continues to inspire us all. So I'm so glad to have you with us. I want to now turn over to Monica, who was also featured in our book and who was also a national leader doing outreach within the AAPI community for the National Education Association, and now works here in California with the California Teachers Association, also advancing civil and human rights. And so, Monica, I was hoping that you could talk about this rise in anti-Asian hate and violence and how it impacts you, not only in terms of your work professionally, but also on a personal level in terms of you and your family.
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see so many familiar faces. Thank you again for just organizing this and inviting me to join this really important conversation. I think definitely during this rise, we saw it amongst our membership. A lot of our members who are public school educators were noticing just their Asian and Asian American students being bullied or made fun of, and as educators who are trying to create safe spaces for our kiddos to learn and thrive, that was really hard on them. Also, Asian American educators are often underrepresented, and our own members were feeling kind of harassment from their colleagues as well, right? I think personally, luckily my family and I were not personally impacted by this recent rise. And Ligaya, I'm so sorry that you were personally impacted. But I guess as I share that, I wonder if maybe hate and violence is just a norm that some of us walk with. Because it's not something new to us, like Ligaya mentioned, and has been a consistent presence for us. And perhaps for many of us, we don't even know the difference anymore. I think about growing up. My grandparents lived just 2 blocks away from us, and would walk over to our house carrying plastic bags of treats or snacks or the mail they needed us to read. And there was always a couple homes in that short 2-block walk where I could tell my grandma hated walking by because they would always yell at her to go back to where she came from, harass her for what she was wearing, or make fun of her for carrying a plastic bag. You know, I also think about when I was living and working in DC and how walking just 1 block away to the metro station, it was like walking through a gauntlet because I would get catcalled and taunted in multiple Asian languages, none of which were any that I understood or spoke. And, you know, I think in refugee communities, often we talk about how sometimes it feels like we fled violence and war in Southeast Asia for another and different form of violence and war in the streets that we were resettled in and tried to build new homes and raise families in. I would also kind of add to this idea of a perpetual foreigner that oftentimes for low-income refugee communities, you know, we've actually been framed as a perpetual victim. Or supermodel minorities or problem minorities, right? And so I think it's these nuances that you know, I think in thinking about this question about how we've been impacted, I think it has definitely stretched more than this time period, and hopefully doesn't continue on and get passed on generationally like it has been for many in our community as well.
Thanks so much, Monica, for linking, you know, the professional and the personal, that our work lives are an integral part of our personal lives, and to talk about that connection and how we can build strength, not only within our own communities and with our own families, but that we bring that strength into our work. And it helps to inform us what we need to do in terms of taking on the broader fight against anti-Asian hate and violence. We're also joined today by my good friend, Kim Jerome, who is a professor at Cal State East Bay and has been a national leader in APALA, and also a local leader and in the Alameda chapter. And he's also a co-author of this book. So I really am grateful for our opportunity to work during 18 months of COVID to put out this book. But Kim, if you could talk about at the local level, you know, there is a large API community in the East Bay and San Francisco. And I know that APALA has done effective organizing on the ground. So what has APALA done specifically to address the rise in anti-Asian hate?
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everybody. And, you know, definitely a shout out to Monica and Lagaya. I mean, I know Monica and I were officers of APALA when the pandemic hit and the rise really escalated of anti-Asian violence, and, you know, Monica's leadership and Lagaya's leadership as a board member to really try and figure these things out as APALA as best as we could, given a lot of this stuff is happening long before COVID and this rise, but still super challenging as people have just described. You know, in our chapter in Alameda, so Alameda, we're the Alameda County chapter of APALA, so we're on the East Bay side of the San Francisco Bay Area. And in our chapter, like many other APALA chapters, I don't think we were unique. We worked closely with our community allies in the API community to figure out what we could do. How could we keep our community safe? What could we do to come up with solutions that would protect our elders who were afraid to leave their homes? You know, I even say my own colleagues, professors, college professors making good money, living in nice communities, many of them would just not leave their home for months. You know, they would order everything in. And so I think that fear factor is real. It still exists amongst many in our community, particularly women, I think, and elders. And I think what we tried to do was partner with allies. So we work closely with the Asian Health Services, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and many other Filipino advocates for justice who were already on the ground in the community working with folks. And we tried to partner with them to do, you know, we did rallies and protests, but we also tried to find ways of providing, if you will, security, you know, escorting people to go to their doctor's appointments and things like that, so they wouldn't feel like they had to stay indoors and not leave their apartments in Chinatown and in the San Antonio area. But in an ongoing way, we decided last year, along with our brothers and sisters in SEIU 10-1, United Healthcare West, and many other API communities, to do something a little bit more ongoing. So we've created a API Heritage Month event every year, last year and this year in Oakland, Chinatown, where we try and come together, work together, build solidarity, but also reach out to our Black and Latino and Indigenous communities in Oakland to work together to put on an event that's multi-ethnic, multi-generational, like APALA, So, and I think that we need to sustain this effort because the violence is going to continue. We know that it happened before, it's going to continue. So we have to continue to organize to address these issues. But I think doing it in a collectivist way with our partners is the best way, and our labor union allies.
Thanks so much, Kim, for lifting that up, because the reality is in 30 years, APALA has always cultivated labor community partnerships, and we've always drawn strength from our friends and allies within the API community who have worked with us on so many projects and campaigns over the years. This provides a really good segue to the next question to Ligaya. As a labor educator, your job is to really build political consciousness, to forge unity among workers of all colors within your union. And why do you think it's important that unions not only be non-racist in their approach, but actually be anti-racist institutions? So could you talk about the role of your union and how you combat racism?
Sure. Well, I think, it's been a change in the past 10 to 15 years to actually be able to explicitly talk about race. When I first became an organizer, it was something that we did not talk about through our organizing work. And I had the opportunity to become involved in APALA from the very beginning of my organizing, and through APALA really felt the critical importance of acknowledging race and talking about race and finding connections across race and with other people that looked like me and had experiences like I have had. And that is part of what has helped me to be strong as an organizer and a leader. And so through our education work in my union, we have really embedded racial justice into all of the organizing work that we are doing. And that was really inspired by work that was done within our international union of SEIU, where a racial justice task force went through a process of really coming to understand that the ways that we were organizing that were really based on economics and class were not getting us the results that we needed to really be able to win. And so we have really acknowledged that racial justice is inextricably linked to economic justice. And because of that new understanding, we have really changed the ways in which we are organizing. And so a lot of what we do is focused at the leadership level of our member leaders and with our staff, doing workshops, really helping people to look at our experiences and to find commonality with each other, but to explicitly utilize a racial justice lens, looking at what we've experienced and what we're doing so that we can really look at the historical aspects of it, look at the ways in which we're all being impacted. And I've been really inspired by the work of John Powell at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, who talks about the notion of othering, and that what we want to do is create a sense of belonging. And that's been a really important piece for our members and staff to come to understand how each of our experiences is, in fact, we all experience othering in some sort of way. But when you apply the history of race, you really can see the ways in which some of us are impacted differently. And because of that, we then have to organize in different ways to ensure that we all can realize what we need to, that if we just apply sort of an equality lens, which is what, we had all kind of been taught to think that way, that if we strive towards something that is the same for everyone, we'll be able to get the best for everyone. But when we apply that kind of lens, what ends up happening is that none of us actually get what we need, because in order to get what we all need to be able to realize the best of our lives. And so that has really helped us to achieve something different through our organizing, through our collective bargaining, through just, our everyday ways of being with each other, that understanding that we have to strive for something different than what we've imagined is what's going to help us to get toward greater freedom and liberation and greater power at the end of the day. And so the difference between anti-racism and being non-racist is that what we're really trying to strive for then is a world in which racism is acknowledged, and that we move past it towards something where we all are experiencing something more like liberation. And so if we just ignore race like it's not there, we're never going to be able to get toward something that is beyond that. And so I think we've been able, through our organizing, to help people kind of move past this point of feeling like we shouldn't talk about race, it's the wrong thing to do, and instead helping people to understand, if we can actually talk about the forms of oppression that we experience, whether it's racism or sexism or homophobia, we're going to better be able to move toward a different future. But if we ignore it, we're never going to be able to get there.
Thank you, Ligaya, and thank you for bringing this historic perspective, that the reality is that for many, many years, there was intense denial within the labor movement of even acknowledging race or even naming it, and a fear that that would be divisive, for us to be talking about racism even within the US labor movement, that would divide us. And some of the concrete, tangible, practical steps that you have outlined are things that we need to replicate in many parts of the labor movement, to take positive steps to build multiracial unity, to build the spirit of liberation, but to acknowledge the existence of racism in society at large, as well as within the labor movement. Monica, I know that you have also addressed these issues at the National Education Association and in your own role as the national president of APALA. And so I want you to share with us, what are some of the things that at a national level you think that APALA has done and will continue to do in terms of advancing racial justice?
Thank you, Ken. Well, obviously, I also invite Ligaya as a current officer, Kim as a former officer, and Kent as our founding national president to chime in as well. But in case folks missed it at our last convention, we actually, at the 2021 convention, APALA actually shared our principles for collective liberation. And there are 7 principles, one being worker power, racial justice, community and chosen family, home and sovereignty, gender justice, and intergenerational movement building. I think to Kent's point about naming things that exist, but also naming things that we belong, we thought it was really important to really pull this together as our guide to our work. So for racial justice, we describe our principle with, we cannot achieve economic justice without racial justice. We must destroy the model minority myth by organizing poor and working class API communities and oppose anti-Blackness so that all people can live freely. We join Black and Indigenous communities to form a more powerful movement toward abolition and ending white supremacy. If you go to that that link, you could even see a little video from one of our member leaders that goes even further in on racial justice, and other videos from member leaders who talk more about our principles. I think in terms of what we've done to build multiracial unity, I know we do a lot of coalition work with other API organizations through coalitions like the National Council for Asian Pacific Americans, as well as with other communities of color like the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and other workers through the AFL-CIO's constituency groups. Sometimes building unity is showing up for each other, right? And that's really, really important. And again, Lagaya, Kim, if there's anything y'all want to add to that as well.
Thanks so much, Monica, for lifting up the 7 principles of liberation, because I think that was a very popular and catchy way of framing what APALA is doing, and some action steps that we could encourage all of our members and friends to engage in. I wanted to go back to Kim and ask him about the process of gathering the stories and publishing Asian American Workers Rising, because this was an 18-month project. It was a labor of love, and it was during the pandemic. So we were able to capture all of these interviews via Zoom, but I wanted to get Kim, as one of our authors, to share his thoughts on that experience.
Thanks, Ken. Just briefly, and I would just to follow up a little bit what Monica said about the 7 principles. I think many of us uttered the words Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd, but what does that really mean to APALA? I think taking and trying to develop and apply those principles, and to really struggle to figure out what does it really mean to build solidarity with Black folks, to uplift their struggles. I just feel like that's just, since we're talking about racial justice today, I think we have to acknowledge that, because that really framed that struggle, that mass movement in this country that took place in 2020 after that horrific murder really launched, I think, APALA's deep reflection about where we were going as an organization. So thanks to Monica for uplifting that, and Ligaya for putting in a lot of work to help develop those principles. So. But as for our book, so while we were doing that work, we were also, as Kent mentioned, for the last 18 months or so, working on a book to acknowledge the work of APALA over the last 30 years. And so Kent, had this brilliant idea to really capture something, tangible for the 30th anniversary of APALA, which began in 1992. And so he helped recruit myself, Tracy Lai from Seattle, Matt Finucane, who we pulled in, our former ED, Emily Israel, who's now in UCLA, and Julie Monroe. And together we became a team that really worked on trying to figure out how to capture stories both of current members of APALA, but also folks who helped found APALA, and to kind of document in a kind of a easy to read, easy to use format that you could use in any Asian American studies class. Somebody who's taught Asian American studies and labor politics. It's the kind of text that is accessible. It's first person by and large, and so you can really read the rich histories of people. But it also, I think, puts a marker in the ground that that APALA and the API in particular, we focus primarily on Asian American workers, and we could talk about that more, but we wanted to really give justice to that. There's obviously a huge need to continue to uplift. Since I see my brother Davida's on and others, we've got to figure out how to tell the story of Pacific Islander workers much more in depth too. But this one was a little bit more focused on Asian American workers. And I think all of those rich histories we were able to bring together and use. To me, it's an organizing tool. It's a book, but you can organize with books. You can Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a book, but it's also an organizing tool that people have used for decades, and we need to continue to uplift our work as well as the work of others that are doing this, kind of intellectual work / activist work to educate the larger community about our struggles. So thanks to Kent and everybody who worked on this project.
Thanks very much, Kim, for sharing those stories. And it was a great project. We had a lot of fun and amazing stories. So if you haven't read the book yet, I encourage you to do so. Ligaya, I know that you are one of the current officers of a national APALA, and APALA is one of a number of constituency groups that represent women, people of color, the LGBT workers within the labor movement. So could you tell me about how work with the other constituency groups is helping to forge multiracial alliances and multiracial action?
Yeah. I think, Kim just lifted up, some of the critical conversations that we've had within APALA about continuing to center Black voices and Black lives, despite, the experiences that we've been having with anti-Asian hate, that we're clear that when we lead on racial justice, we have to acknowledge the anti-Blackness within our communities, and that we also need to stand for Black lives. And I think that that's been a really critical conversation throughout APALA that we've had. And I know that at the national level, our executive director, Alvina Ye, has played a really important role with the other constituency groups, which, if you don't know who they are the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, both of which represent Black workers, LACLA, which represents Latinx workers, and there's a couple of others, the Coalition of Labor Union Women and Pride at Work, which represents the LGBTQIA community. And Alvina has played a really important role with the organization that they all are connected to, the Progressive Workers Coalition, having conversations about racial justice and the work that we need to be doing with each other. We recently, through APALA and the Coalition of Labor Union Women, hosted a webinar on women's and API issues together. And that's, an example of some of the work that we've been doing together. I can tell you that at the local level, that is where a lot of kind of the rubber meets the road. And a lot of us do kind of on our day-to-day work through APALA work, forging alliances with the other constituency groups. In Seattle, we have done a lot of work with our fellow constituency groups where we built a coalition that we didn't have before the murder of George Floyd, where we said, okay, we need to come together to organize through our labor movement to make sure that Black voices get heard here. And we were also able, through the coalition that we've been able to build, to then lift up our concerns around anti-Asian hate. What we know is that, historically speaking, white workers have forged a lot of solidarity through the labor movement, and historically, people of color in the labor movement have not forged those same sorts of alliances. And so we've been able to do that more by coming together with the other constituency groups at the local level and national level to really leverage our collective power to lift up our concerns. So in Seattle, we've been able to now kick off a racial justice task force in our labor council. And we have been able to do organizing work. One of the outcomes of that work was that the Seattle Police Officers Guild was kicked out of our labor council because people had critical questions about what they were doing in the labor council and whether we actually had the same shared values. And so through our constituency groups coming together, we went and had conversations with the Police Officers Guild and found, no, we don't have the same values. And we were able to bring a critical conversation to the Labor Council, and they were expelled. So that's, one example where, it was through building those coalitions that we were able to do something tangible together. And now we're working together to really change our labor council. And we're setting goals for, 3 years, 10 years down the road. What do we want our labor council to look like? What do we want our unions to look like? And we're having the conversations about the need for real changes in leadership of unions, to have people of color, women in leadership roles. And it's really by forging those kinds of alliances that we can push those issues forward and build the kind of power and get the resources that are needed to actually lift people up and empower them through our unions. At the national level, Alvina played a really critical role in the AFL-CIO Racial Justice Committee about the role of police unions and other critical issues. And she was able to partially do that through connections and support from the other constituency groups. So I think, for each of us in the places that we sit, we got to look around and see who are the other allies that we can build relationships with who are also people of color. Because what we know is that we can really do something different if we build those kinds of coalitions. And historically, we haven't done that. Historically, we've tried to go it alone, but we know that if we actually stop doing that and look around and find others that we can get support from, we can actually do something different through our labor movement.
Thanks very much, Ligaya, and sharing the efforts within the labor movement to make these changes. Monica, I know that the California Teachers Association represents teachers and education workers throughout the state of California, and that you have personally been involved in advancing ethnic studies in the K-12 schools. Could you tell me about what CTA is doing, especially under a period where ethnic studies and critical race theory has been the target of attack by the right wing across the country?
Of course, and I would be, and I know Kim is going to follow up with this too, because I also want to really admit that there was a time where CTA did not endorse or support an ethnic studies graduation requirement. But through members and our activists organizing from the bottom up, within a couple of years, we went from not supporting to not only supporting, but actually co-sponsoring and lobbying the support of. And that's really the power that I think Ligaya talks about in terms of organizing and where the rubber hits the road. And I think it's important to really admit where our unions are strong and powerful, but also where they fall short and where we have room to grow, right? And so in terms of pushback, our initial approach has really, our initial and our historic approach has really been focused on safety, security, legal rights, and contractual rights of our members, which was led by our field in relationship and partnership with our legal department. And as we've seen most of these attacks happening online and catching on in the media, our communications team has also been pulled into support. However, in the past 2 years, my team in the CTA Human Rights Department, we've really been pushing the organization to change and to move beyond that approach to a broader and more holistic approach that goes beyond safety and security, but actually works to transform, empower, and lean on what makes us a strong union, which is our collective strength and our collective power. We feel like we have to do this to continue to grow this work, which we know is the right work for our students and our communities. It's the work that we need and we deserve, right? So, some of this is still very bureaucratic. We are still looking at laws and contractual language, but the conversation isn't just stopping there anymore. It's no longer just stopping at contractual or legal rights or guidance to shut down social media accounts or talking points to leaders. We're trying a different approach. One is, we're looking at what we've been doing and what has been working to set a standard, to make things consistent. But we're also re-looking at what we've been doing with a racial and social justice lens to adjust and to be more transformative and aligned with our principles and values. And then third, what we're doing is also creating new processes and structures for continuous support of our members who are doing racial and social justice work. The hope of this is to move beyond a reactionary check the box, move on kind of response to one that again goes beyond safety and security of our members, but moves towards empowerment, the ability to organize and mobilize for support, and to build that collective power for ethnic studies, critical race theory, teaching the truth, safe spaces for our members and kiddos to teach and learn and thrive. And also all this other racial and social justice work that we know we need to do for our communities. And we're really, it's going to be a long journey, but we're here for it because that's how we're going to win. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Monica. And the fight for ethnic studies in public schools is a huge breakthrough. And we really hope that more states around the country will take on this fight to expand ethnic studies and expand education, which is such a critical part of developing a philosophy of liberation and developing an anti-racist framework in the work that we do. Kim, I know that, as someone who has taught in ethnic studies and higher education, that the very existence of ethnic studies was a result of student movements and student protests back in the 60s and 70s. But if you could talk about the continuing fight to build and expand ethnic studies today, and what is going on in terms of the attacks on ethnic studies and critical race theory in higher education.
Yeah, it's a big topic, as Monica's just scratched the surface in the K through 12 level, but the overall fight for ethnic studies is something that began more than 50 years ago. Really the movement to establish an ethnic studies program began at San Francisco State and spread quickly to UC Berkeley and UCLA in the late 60s and to other campuses. And I was fortunate I was able to start San Francisco State in 1970 and was able to be one of the first students to be able to actually take classes in Asian American studies. That was my major. And very different approach towards ethnic studies than it is today in many campuses, unfortunately. But it was, I say that because it was born out of the struggle of students of color, Black students, Indigenous students at San Francisco State, as well as Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, American students who really, occupied buildings, went on strikes for months to demand, an education that reflected their own experience. And while today there are many ethnic studies programs around the country, there's still a minority on most campuses. Most big universities don't have even an ethnic studies program. Harvard, for example, does not have an ethnic studies program, a whole department focused on that. And, not that that's, the bellwether of anything, but it is a reflection that we have a long way to go to establish ethnic studies programs in all of our higher education institutions. Today, I would just comment that even where these programs exist, most often they're optional. If they're offered at all, they're optional. And so unfortunately, many students don't even get exposed to actually taking an ethnic studies class. So it's in that context that my union, the California Faculty Association, working with ethnic studies faculty in our Cal State University system, fought to establish a requirement that every student in the CSU and in the community colleges in California be required to take an ethnic studies class. I mean, it's a minimal requirement. Just one class is obviously not enough, but it was a start. And we figured that we had to get that process started. And so after several years of organizing on our campuses amongst ourselves, we were able to work with really progressive legislators to get this bill established in 2020 and signed by Governor Newsom in 2020. Now, every student who enters the community college and a California State University is required to take an ethnic studies class. That requirement actually existed long ago in the UCs, and that's why it was so ridiculous that we never had that same requirement. So, but that being said, now we at least have that. And now the struggle is as Monica was getting into a little bit of the technical difficulty details, we have the same challenge, but it's really a fight to hire people. It's very difficult to hire tenure track faculty. And so this law, AB 1460, requires and provided funding to hire more faculty in ethnic studies. And so that's the exciting part. So we're seeing a kind of a resurgence of hiring of Asian American and other ethnic studies faculty. And we're now fighting to get more curriculum, more courses offered, and to really educate this next generation who really need to understand ethnic studies to find their place in this world. If you don't have that, you really are lacking. You're missing a whole analysis. Along with, we need a labor class requirement too, Kent. We'll work on that next, but at least we need this ethnic studies thing. So anyway, maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Kim. And once again, these are really powerful models of how a statewide grassroots organizing campaign resulted in institutionalizing ethnic studies in community colleges and Cal State University campuses throughout California. And we are absolutely committed to move this at the University of California to make ethnic studies and labor studies a requirement. So that's stay tuned for future campaigns. But I wanted to now take a short music break. We're going to show a music video, "We Belong." It was the lyrics are from Chris Ijima, a veteran Asian American singer-songwriter who played a huge role in influencing the cultural expression of the early days of the Asian American movement back in the 1970s. And these very same lyrics were picked up by a new generation of Asian American cultural workers who are engaged in the fight against anti-Asian violence. So enjoy "We Belong."
I'm here, grew up on the shores of America. Open up shop, ran stores in America. Wash windows, clean floors in America. Only trust me with your chores in America. Just need one open door in America. Cried when we elected 44 for America. My family's here, fought wars for America. On TV, just a whore for America. I get the memo, this is your America. Just take my money, tax forms in America. Take a food, charge more in America. Use a culture for decor in America. History that you can't ignore. America, I'm the leader I was looking for. America, never silent, keeping score. America, and it's time I needed more. We're still here, we're going strong, and we're getting tired of proving we belong. We're still here, we're going strong, and we're getting tired of proving we belong. Proving we belong.
Come a long way. But what's changed since Vincent Chin? The difference just names. Xiao Zhe Dao Yao Sun Jia know these names. Hyun Jung Sun Jung Young we have names. Victims silence, evicted from our lives, cause our skin is the color they love to villainize. But if it's food, movies, and women, they love to fetishize. But if it's COVID-19, then China virus. Fuck these colonizers, calling us outsiders. We built this country too, and they built it alongside us. One generation, two, generation three. To the young generation, you generate me. So T, Tayo, and one, and Chucky, and anyone that feels like a guest in their country. And everyone has ever lost a body to the struggle. No, you're not alone. I promise all of my people, y'all, we love you when we're here.
We're going strong, and we're getting tired of proving we belong. We're still here, we're going strong, and we're getting tired of proving we belong. Proving we belong.
I've washed the clothes, and these hands have served the food heaven knows. And my neck has felt the mob's rope and has been behind barbed wire. My arms have nailed down railroad track, our back has been for hire. And these hands have fought injustice and this soul is on fire. We belong to each other, magnitude and bond. Black feminist scholarship, indigenous songs belong at the center like ethnic studies. Be the Robin Hood and invest in us. We be living pleasure acts abundantly. Abolition is healing our suffering. Belonging our purpose to the ones in need. Cause if one ain't got it, ain't no one free. I speak from the streets of Lenape Ho King. All my relations need reparations. Power to the people, our disposition. Belong to the land with First Nations permission. Maktub, the word that was written when we decolonize. We belong to wisdom, the cry for liberty, the right side of history. Overstand the bigotry, it's never really finished.
Still here, we're going strong, and we're getting tired of proving we belong. We're still here, we're going strong, and we're getting tired of proving we belong. Proving we belong.
So I'm happy to share the link with We Belong as well, if anyone wants to use it in your own educational events, workshops, forums in your areas. But I think it's really powerful to draw from the words of Chrissy Jima from decades ago and to apply it to the rise of anti-Asian hate today. I wanted to thank my good friends, Ligaya, Domingo, Monica, Tamaranth, and Kim Jerome so much for joining us, but also for your friendship and for being part of my family all these years. And one of the things that I think is not appreciated and respected enough is the people that you meet in the course of building social justice movements are people who will be your friends for life and will always have your back. And so it is such a pleasure spending time with Kim, with Ligaya, with Monica, and we know that we will do, we'll raise a lot more good trouble in the years to come. I wanted to thank Vina Hampapur, Emily Israel, Chris Jang from the UCLA Labor Center for helping to put together our workshop series. I wanted to thank Justine Lim and Lena Wang, who are coordinating a 5-member Dream Summer API team. I wanted to thank Lisa, Hazel, and Anna for your work in mobilizing for this event. And please join us 2 weeks from today. We will be focusing on organizing at a time where there's a tremendous upsurge in organizing across the country. We will be joined by Arlene Inouye from the United Teachers of Los Angeles, Kathleen Yasuda from the LA Trade Tech Labor Center, Brady Kalma, our current APALA National President, and with SEIU UHW, and Aquilina Soriano from the Filipino Workers Center. So join us 2 weeks from today. Lena has prepared an evaluation. If any of you would like to respond to that, please fill out the evaluation that she just dropped into the chat. But thank you so much, Kim, Ligaya, and Monica, and thank all of you for joining us. We will be posting this recording on the APALA website and on the UCLA Labor Center website.